The Giza Plateau is the most complex historical site on the planet. Yes, physically complex, with the impressive size of the pyramids, the architectural precision and mathematical principles incorporated into their design, and the layout matching the stars of the constellation Orion. But it's also the center and origin point of several cultures, religions, traditions, and technologies. The ancient name for Giza was Kemet, which is where we get the word chemistry. I really hope that you've watched the rest of the Tinfoil Helmet series by now, otherwise a lot of this video is just going to go right over your head. But remember, this is just for fun. Don't take this too seriously. I'm just spinning together a little bit of wizardry and magic for your entertainment. But a lot of what I discuss in this series is true, and it's fun to think about these things in new ways. But if you've gotten this far in the playlist, you must agree by now that there are some pretty enigmatic things about history, and it's totally fair for us to ask at this point, is history a lie? So far, I've shown you a lot of physical examples of strange things throughout history and pieced them together for you in sort of a meaningful way. But wouldn't it make more sense to understand the mindset and the religion of the cultures that actually built those things? This is probably going to be the strangest video in the series because it's going to tie together a lot of really abstract concepts from several different cultures. However, I believe that this is the video that I'm the most confident about. In my Tesla video, I described my theory about a specific building complex layout that we see throughout history. Two buildings, a fountain and a pillar, with a park in the middle, that were able to conduct some level of electricity. A theory that I feel I demonstrated is likely true. In that video, I referred to those complexes as parks, because that's what we call them today. But that's not what the ancient people called them. The ancients called them gardens. The ionized air and ionized water that I hinted promoted good health would also promote rich crops and bountiful harvests. The reason why the Freemasons and occult groups venerate the pyramids is because all of these gardens around the world are based on the design of the Giza Plateau. But the Giza Plateau is not just the inception point of culture and technology. The Giza Plateau is where it all began. Giza was the Garden of Eden. Did I just casually reveal the location of the Garden of Eden in the intro of my video? Yep, that's the kind of video you're in for today, so you better strap in because I got a lot of information to throw at you. Welcome back to Tinfoil Helmet. Göbekli Tepe is an extremely important site. It represents the inception point for civilization. It's where farming and complex architecture were developed by humans. Or maybe we were taught by some sort of giant. It appears as if there was some sort of giant venerated at the site, perhaps even worshipped. But the site also seems to represent a turning over point. I alluded to some of the carvings describing a cataclysmic event. Well, if this is Scorpio, then this is the constellation Cygnus, also known as the Northern Cross. Often depicted as a bird, she seems to be holding a large ball, maybe an egg? What if this represents the Great Phoenix, the flaming bird god that dies and comes back to life as its own child, sacrificing itself in fire to give life to its egg? This art is depicting the same kind of celestial event that the Book of Revelation describes as the dragon. I would never argue that the Bible is true or that it's historically accurate, but I've come to the inescapable conclusion that there is truth in there. There is history in there. Events, places, rulers, cultures, and names that they use for different kinds of people, like classes of people, like the sons of God, the sons of Cain, the messenger angels, the Nephilim. I don't think that these were made-up terms for non-existent characters. I'm convinced that these were terms that they used to describe real people. Many of them would have been considered different shaman or priest classes that had greater connection to God, basically. Obviously, many of them were considered to be gods themselves. Later, they would have become the emperors or god kings of our societies, convinced that they were descended from the gods themselves, or the fish people, or the dragon people, or the lion people. But they all would have been related to the Homo Denisovin in some way. If you've been watching the series or listening to my podcasts, then you know my theory that these god kings were different species or hybrid species of humans. DNA recently recovered from Denisovin Cave proves that sapiens cohabitated and interbred with Denisovin and Neanderthal around 30,000 years ago. They likely produced a wide variety of hybrid offspring, many of which continuing to procreate for thousands of years. And with deviations over time, this would explain the many different names for the many different kinds of hybrid humans that existed back then. And like I described, they were forced to interbreed with sapiens, so over time their heads began to shrink and they began to look more and more like normal humans. But there's an ancient story that's told over and over again in multiple cultures, religions, myths and legends, in ancient literature and plays, and even in modern film, and it's referred to as the hero's journey. And that is exactly the story that the Giza plateau is trying to tell us, tying the green god Osiris to the layout of the stars 12,000 years ago. It serves as a time capsule to the Younger Dryas event, showing when we started all over again after the world almost ended. This was the massive global cataclysm that knocked out Atlantis, the flood of the Bible. This is a story that's mirrored in multiple religions around the world. But what's crazy is that I found themes that were universal across all cultures, suggesting that the people back then witnessed some sort of massive celestial event, a war in the heavens. And I'm convinced that whatever the people saw in the sky back then is tied to the disaster that happened here on Earth. That was awesome. I can't prove today that Giza is the Garden of Eden. If you want more of my thoughts on that idea, you'll have to listen to my podcast about it. The newest stuff that we consider ancient Egyptian comes from the dynastic Egyptians. They're the ones who built most of the simpler structures with smaller stones or brick. They covered the original Sphinx with brick to make it look like a lion, and made the head a human face. The paradox that we see here is that the further back in time we go, the more complex and more impressive the construction seems to be. This is something that I'm not 100% sure about, but a lot of people think that because the Giza Plateau has elements that date back 12,000 years, that the pyramids must be that old as well, but I don't think so. I think the layout is 12,000 years old, but the pyramids were built much later with preserved knowledge. They rebuilt the Garden of Eden in its original glory. It's a monument to heaven, a monument to the triple God, or what we now would call the Trinity. The limestone portion of the pyramids dates back 5,000 or 6,000 years at the oldest. I think that the foundations of the pyramids are what date back 12,000 years. Remember, I showed you the Menkaure pyramid is built on top of a much older foundation that's clearly Atlantean era construction. But what about the Khufu pyramid? The Great Pyramid, the one that's right in the center of the Earth? What's the secret behind that one? Well, that structure is built on solid limestone bedrock, but the natural foundation is shaped like a hill or a mound. Hills and mountains were the preferred locations to communicate with the gods during the Neolithic Age, and even before that. When you enter the top of the foundation through what looks like a drain hole, you'll find this little cubby space where the walls are lined with sand and pebbles. A stark contrast to the precision engineering that we see in the rest of the structure. I believe that this was the hole that the shaman would climb into to communicate with the gods after taking his happy juice. Then there's the well room in the basement, a chamber and corridor carved into solid stone. This space too looks completely different from the rest of the structure. The room seems like it's chiseled away haphazardly, like they didn't care at all how it looked. Then there are these amorphous blobs of stone in the middle of the room. I think that this is the original well for the original garden built tens of thousands of years ago. This decaying room is the ruins of a truly ancient temple. But what about the constellation Orion, the green-faced god Osiris who the Egyptians tied to the layout of the Giza plateau? Plateau. Osiris, just like Jesus, is a god of death and resurrection. He was chopped up into pieces by his brother Set and then reassembled by his wife. However, his reproductive organ had to be replaced with a golden phallus. So just like the Conehead video, the religion has an emphasis on the phallus. That is represented in the stars. In the constellation Orion, if you'll notice, the Orion Nebula between his legs gives a golden glow. Gilgamesh, too, is a representation of Orion, sometimes depicted with a sword angled across his waist, representing Orion's belt, and a tassel between his legs, like the golden member of Osiris. The giant Gilgamesh often represented holding a lion, like the depictions of the constellation Orion. Again linking Orion to the constellation Leo, making the same reference to the 12,000 year ago mark as the Giza plateau. The battle between Orion and Leo being a key to the cataclysm that occurs in that time period. This image is reversed, but Gilgamesh also holds one weapon above his arm, again like the constellation. Osiris was later succeeded by his son Horus, who also has parallels to that same archetype. Horus created Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, tasked with destroying things, who later became a protector goddess. A character that transformed, as it were. This time is more poignant, as Horus is technically a sun god figure, and Sekhmet links him to a lion, just like the constellation Orion. Christians have their own trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Jesus was even referred to as the Lion of Judah. Egypt has Osiris, Horus, and Isis, and the Hindu tradition, or at least one of the trinities that they represent, is Shiva, Parvati, and Ganesh. It gets complicated because there are several different trinities and each god has different manifestations, but Parvati is represented with a tiger or often a lion. But my favorite version of her is called Durga, and she's a protector goddess. Her protector form has multiple arms, again represented with a lion. A lot of parallels with Sekhmet. Durga also has a destroyer form known as Kali. Kali also has multiple different forms, one of which being a pregnant woman with a trident and lions. Do you get it? These kinds of images are just absolutely saturated, layered with meaning. But what do they mean? And how do they tie back to the apocalypse? Our ancestors were obsessed with describing celestial movements as the stories of gods and the heroes of old. And most of these stories have endured throughout history in one form or another. Arguably, Christianity started with the Apostle Paul going around describing Jesus's events in heaven. There are tons of gods of death and rebirth across multiple cultures, and people have argued that that old pagan version of that god came first, and then when Christianity came along, the Roman Catholic Church used it as a veneer to cover up their pre-existing pagan religion, and that's why there's such a similarity. The Christ is a copy of this green-faced god. But I've heard Christians argue that Satan counterfeited the Messiah story, knowing that a real Messiah would one day come along, making it too confusing to know which was the real one. Christians are pretty stubborn when it comes to understanding cultures outside of their own. But they can't deny that the deeds and events surrounding their Messiah perfectly fit this pre-existing archetype. But maybe both sides of that argument are wrong. Maybe they all represent the same person. Maybe they're all talking about the same thing. Or multiple appearances of the same thing? What if what the people described in the Bible was a reoccurrence of what happened 12,000 years ago? See, if we want to see the beginning, we have to go way back. Way back to the prototypical character that started it all. Though it's debated exactly where he originated, it seems as if he was worshipped all over Eurasia in prehistoric times. And we call him the Green Man. There's no way of knowing exactly how far back he goes, or if he had a real name. But there were clearly multiple versions of him throughout history. Made of bark, leaves, flowers, thorns, antlers, or horns sometimes. He holds a golden snake of death and rebirth. The narrative obviously tied to nature, dying in the winter and coming back to life in the spring. A later version sees him as a villain, the Green Knight. This is where we notice our first indications of role reversal as well. I get the impression that each culture represented the story differently because they didn't understand what they were seeing in the sky. There's clearly a hero and a villain, but sometimes an element that seems to describe the hero in one story describes the villain in the other. Sometimes green means good, and sometimes green means bad. The story of the Green Knight sees a giant green man barge into Sir Gawain's red domain, swinging an axe above his head in a pose identical to the constellation Orion, challenging Sir Gawain to a duel. In a swift move, Sir Gawain decapitates the Green Knight, defeating him. The Green Knight then picks up his head, says, "You've won this round, but I'll be back for you next year," and then leaves. Osiris is probably the most similar to that, having been chopped up into several different pieces by his brother. But I think that this represents how that culture spread across Africa, and then when the Sahara Desert dried up, all those cultures came back together as one cohesive unit again. Clearly, the micro-narrative of the Green Man is the cycle of nature, the death and rebirth of foliage and animals. But what if there's a macro-narrative to this story? What if it represents something greater, a more ominous death and rebirth cycle that happens with our planet? Something that's so difficult to remember that we had to code it into our most popular story, the hero's journey. What exactly is so important about 12,000 years ago that we have to keep remembering it? Why do we keep telling this story over and over again? I love riddles. That's probably why I got so stuck on the riddle of the Sphinx. I got a couple for you. They're pretty easy. Who am I? If you ask my followers, they'd say that I'm a very special boy. But if you ask me, I simply feel like I am. Okay, I got another one. It's a little bit harder. There was a man sitting on a street corner wearing a mask that read, "The King with Nothing." Someone walked up to this man, lifted his mask, and recognized that he was actually the king of everything. But the man put his mask back on and disappeared into the crowd. Why would he do that? Alright, I got another one that we can actually answer in this video. What the hell is this keyhole shape that the Sphinx makes? And what does this have to do with the apocalypse? The green god's death and rebirth, being a metaphor for vegetation, is tied in also with the stories of Christmas and Easter. But that's just the micro-narrative. The meta-narrative parallels that story, and I think that Giza proves that the death and rebirth of the entire Earth is tied to the Green Man, to the massive cataclysm that happened 12,000 years ago, the story of the Great Phoenix. So here's my logic, and I think you'll agree. By creating a layout at the Giza Plateau depicting the Green Man, and then tying it to that specific event that happened 12,000 years ago, they're saying that the Green Man also represents the death and rebirth of the entire planet. The hero's journey is about that specific apocalyptic event. At first I thought that all of these stories were talking about that specific event, that one time, 12,000 years ago. But I have a theory that each culture also has separate stories that are very similar, talking about lesser events that happened after that, where there's either similar characters with different names, role reversals, or the same god but doing a completely different thing, representing the same basic idea. Here's where we have to trust artists' renditions of these characters. If you've seen the Da Vinci Code, I mean, it's not a great movie, but it's a perfect example of the kind of coding that I'm talking about in art. Now, the hero's journey has a ton of elements, lots of things to juggle. It's basically impossible to get all of them into a single 90-minute movie. However, you may have noticed that Jesus is usually depicted wearing red and blue. Sometimes he wears just one or the other, depending on the context. Like in this picture, he's wearing blue and Satan is red. This is depicting the same sort of confrontation though. But red and blue are prominent colors in multiple religions, as well as green, gold, purple. We'll get to those later. But color plays an important role in these stories. I know that this sounds silly, but the colors of his robe represent the colors of the sky. The adversary, the destroyer, the dragon, the phoenix, whatever you want to call it. When it's here, it literally turns the entire sky red. And I don't mean like it glows red or it's like a sunset. I mean, it's a dramatic, drastic, dense red. And it undulates and dances because our sky is being pelted by highly electromagnetically charged plasma, likely from our own sun. We have an example of this happening, culminating in a dramatic episode in August of 1859 known as the Carrington event. This was when the Earth was pelted by multiple, rapid, highly charged solar flares. And I think that the Carrington event holds a clue or a hint as to what the ancient people were seeing in the skies 12,000 years ago. Everything I described with the undulating red sky really happened in 1859. That was real. They got off easy back then. The worst that happened were telegraph lines were highly charged and it disrupted communications for a while. But if it happened today, it would not only knock out our entire satellite network, it would blast all of our technology. We'd be back in the 1800s overnight. But even though Jesus wears red and blue, he clearly represents the green man. So if the great dragon or the destroyer or the phoenix or whatever is the red flaming thing, what is the green thing? What does the green man represent? The Aurora Borealis. It's so obvious. The green man is the Earth's electromagnetic field, protecting us from solar events. Atheist author Richard Carrier suggests that the four Gospels were written in Greek play format, a hypothesis that I fully agree with. Now, Jesus spent 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, but that hardly denotes some sort of connection with nature. However, John the Baptist parallels Jesus in the Gospels. He's literally described as a wild man. He lives in the woods. He wears animal pelts. So when he anoints Jesus as the Son of God, that's visual language saying the guy that looks like the green man says this other guy is the green man. That's supposed to give him credibility. That's what's being communicated through the visual language of the story. And then John the Baptist, if you remember, his story ends with him being beheaded, exactly like the Green Knight. Before the great apocalyptic event that's being represented through the crucifixion of Jesus, there's an earlier altercation where Satan tests Jesus at the top of the earth. You get it? At the top of the earth, at the North Pole, where the Aurora Borealis is. The great dragon briefly tests the green man. There's an early solar flare. It's a warning sign that the great event is imminent. And there are several hints that Jesus' death represent the apocalypse. Like in Matthew, it says that as soon as he dies, the earth opens up and people rise from the dead. Now, in Norse tradition, their apocalypse is known as Ragnarok. But there's also an earlier event that happens in Odin's story, where just like Jesus, he's spread out, cross-legged against a tree, and he's stabbed in the heart with a spear because Odin wants to experience death. And Odin also has a companion, the head of the god of wisdom. Again, a parallel to the Green Man. Thor also represents the Green Man as well as Odin. If you imagine Thor wielding his hammer above his head, just like the constellation Orion. Also, he has the Belt of Strength, the Belt of Orion. Gilgamesh also fought a giant winged, horned dragon monster figure, as seen in this relief artwork depicting him in the pose of Orion. Notice that he's also carrying trident weapons. Tridents represent the 3 stars of the belt. I'm going to get more into the details of what's literally happening above us during the apocalypse, but what people are seeing essentially is like a red flamey thing and a massive electrical storm in the sky. And this would likely focus on the North Pole, where the cross star is. Zeus not only can turn into an eagle, a lightning eagle, that sounds familiar, but he also fought Typhoeus. Typhoeus is the personification of volcanic forces, but he's represented as a winged god with multiple tentacles or tails. The tentacles and tails represent different arcs of plasma coming down and attacking the Earth from space. The multiple legs or tentacles of Cthulhu. So picture it, Zeus, the lightning god, fighting a giant winged tentacled fire god in the sky. That's the apocalypse. It's often implied that the dragon or the phoenix figure has multiple tails or tentacles. That may be plasma forming thick, structured arcs, like the effect that you get off of a Tesla coil, but bumped up to the planetary scale, almost as if the sky looks like the inside of a plasma ball toy. The hero's journey and the Green Man are represented in pop culture as well. The hero's journey will never die. Superman wears red and blue exactly like Jesus. Zack Snyder hammered it into our heads in Man of Steel that Superman represents Jesus. We get it, dude. We get it. And Zack Snyder was right that that's not an S, but it's also not a winding river. Though that might be a reference to the River Nile, it's actually a snake. It's a pyramid and a snake. And the pyramid is pointing down, which implies that he's an earthbound god, as in he's Jesus. The snake is not only the same snake of death and rebirth that the Green Man holds, but the snake is the goddess Wojat. The Wojat eye is often referred to as the Eye of Horus, literally represents death and rebirth, as well as wisdom. And the snake goddess Wojat is a protective deity that defends Egypt. I bet you didn't know any of that about Superman. Spider-Man also wears red and blue. His webs represent the Earth's electromagnetic field catching plasma. But if you look at the model of the Earth's electromagnetic field in action, you notice how it takes the shape of a spider? Spider-Man is a reference to the Green Man, and most of his villains are green. Green Goblin is a green and purple smiling figure, like the Treasure Cat. He's just like the Joker. He fits the Laughing Man archetype perfectly. The Laughing Man is an esoteric concept. I think actually ties back to the Laughing Jesus, a Gnostic version of Jesus that existed probably well before the Roman Catholics got a hold of him. The Gnostics believed that while physically Jesus was being tortured on the cross, spiritually he was off in some cave somewhere laughing, because it didn't mean anything. It was happening in the physical, but in the spiritual, he was above it all. That's essentially what it means. The Catholics have a saint that's a joker as well, Saint Lawrence. He was actually martyred by the church. The Pope ordered his death, and he was cooked on a grill like a T-bone steak. His dying words were, "Flip me over, I'm well done on this side," which got roaring laughter from the audience of people there to watch a guy burn to death. Well, I found more than one example of St. Lawrence being depicted alongside Mary Magdalene, the woman that Jesus married. That's not a coincidence. I think that the Treasure Cat smile, or the Joker smile, is representative of a crescent moon shape or a solar eclipse shape, because that seems to be depicted quite often alongside apocalyptic imagery. And imagine the ominous feeling you'd have when you see this big smiling figure in the sky over top of you while chaos is happening here on Earth. That'd be pretty terrifying. I know it's kind of crazy to think of the Joker as a depiction of Jesus, but obviously he is the Green Man. His purple coat is a blending of red and blue. Purple is the color of chaos. And purple also just happens to be one of the colors of the Aurora Borealis. In the Michael Keaton Batman movie, just like Jesus, Joker trolls the powers that be. He even hurts the banks by giving away free money. When the Bat Jet appears in front of the moon, that's a representation of the Great Dragon. Batman, with his horns, represents the devil. This is the Mayan god of death. Batman is death. During this scene, Joker is spreading green gas across the city, representing the Earth's electromagnetic field. The Great Dragon descends down into the green fog. The Green Man defeats the Great Dragon, causing him to fall from the sky. But despite his victory, he still dies at the hands of the Great Dragon. And while his body lay there dead and motionless, he continues to laugh. And the latest Joker movie, the one that I love so much, obviously represents a lot of the same concepts. But the guy that plays the Joker, Joaquin Phoenix, his name is Joking Phoenix. I could do a whole episode about how Star Wars is about the apocalypse, but just some examples. The lightsabers obviously represent the battle between red and blue. And in the end, when Luke fights Vader, it's green. And then after defeating him with the green lightsaber, he then sacrifices himself for his father, allowing himself to be defeated by purple lightning. One way to describe the keyhole shape is a representation of the Alpha and the Omega. The pyramid shape on the bottom half is the A, and the domed top half is an O. I know that this sounds dumb, but think of how many ways that this shape is incorporated into different things in pop culture and even religions. There are so many secret references to the Alpha and the Omega. Like a UFO beaming up a cow, the saucer is the Omega, and the beam is the Alpha. The Phoenicians too had their own Alpha and Omega keyhole symbol, which cleverly looked like an eye. I also like the Stairway to Heaven image. This even ties the Sphinx to the Jacob's Ladder concept. Some people even consider this a symbol of the rapture, something you might see in the sky pulling you up. It's also often depicted through a rising sun symbol. If you imagine the top half being the sun rising above the horizon, and the bottom half, the A, being light reflecting off of the ocean. But those are just ways that the symbol are cleverly integrated into art and religion. What does the symbol actually represent? This is the fun part. The Green Man is tied to fertility, a very important aspect of growing crops and raising livestock. Remember that the Giza plateau is a garden. Osiris, the green god of the Garden of Eden, had a golden phallus, implying his ability to promote fertility. But Osiris's golden phallus is an important element of the Giza plateau story, and it ties together with the Green Man's golden snake of death and rebirth. Remember again how 12,000 years ago the Sphinx would point at the sun and Leo during the summer solstice, and at that same time, the pyramids would line up with the constellation Orion? Well, the Sphinx pointed at Leo, but that's not what it was lined up with. Leo would have been several miles away. Look where the Sphinx is in orientation with the pyramids. The Sphinx lines up with the Orion Nebula. The Sphinx is Osiris's golden penis. The face of the Sphinx is the face of Osiris. That's the green man. If you don't believe me, a perfect example of this is one of the oldest Greek and Mysian gods, the god of gardens. And do you see what prominent feature he displays? That's right. He has a silly hat. Fertility is the name of the game. This is tied to that exact same fascination with the phallus that the coneheads displayed in my conehead video. They were absolutely obsessed with fertility and prowess. And to just absolutely nail my point home, let's go to southern England, where there's an ancient Celtic giant on a hillside they say is wrapped in mystery. What could it be? Who could have built it? This green giant happens to be wielding a weapon above his head, just like the constellation Orion. And just like the green god Osiris, just so happens to have a giant phallus that's pointing in the general direction of the summer solstice sun. You get it yet? Guys, you're looking at the green man. Scholars believe that the pyramids of Giza are mentioned twice in the Bible. Once as the mountains of the West, and again as the mountain of God. It's no wonder that the ancient people would have seen these structures as godly mountains. Every ancient religion venerated mountains and hills and mounds, using them as the place to communicate with God. Like Mount Olympus, mountains are where the gods lived. The electricity that the pyramids generated was part of their religion, and as I described in the earlier video, the higher up that they could build a structure, the more electricity that it could generate. So to decode the meaning of the story of Babylon, which happens right after the flood, humanity gathered in one place to build their own tower to reach heaven, basically dictating their own terms as to where God's throne was going to be. God punished them for this by destroying the tower and spreading humanity across the globe. Now, a little Bible tidbit for you Bible geeks out there. Deuteronomy 32:8. It says that after this happened, God separated the nations and the sons of Adam according to the number of the children of Israel. And that doesn't make any sense because Israel doesn't exist yet. Abraham hasn't even been born yet. So, turns out in the Dead Sea Scrolls, what it originally said was, God separated everyone according to the number of the sons of God. The sons of God were the Denisovin, the Coneheads. This is why the exact same story is told in every religion. The Bible is recognizing that this was the time that the Coneheads spread this story across the globe. So fast forward to the very end of Egyptian culture, right before its collapse at the end of the Bronze Age. The Phoenicians all of a sudden show up, and a lot of people attribute them to the collapse of Egypt, but that's not entirely true. But the Phoenicians are like, yo guys, I love your language. It's so cool. But wouldn't it be neat that instead of these intricate drawings, we replace them all with these easily sketchable lines so that we can write sentences extremely quickly and communicate so much more efficiently? So they create this new language, Egypt collapses, the Phoenicians slow motion walk away from Cairo while the pyramids explode in the background, rock music blasting as they're carrying their new language in a briefcase. But then they start traveling across the entire Mediterranean, even other parts of the globe. And they teach new languages to all of the cultures that they meet based on the original language that they created in Egypt, making a new distinct language for each individual culture. And a lot of things come along with language: religious concepts, philosophical concepts, the ability or inability to articulate complex concepts. I know what I'm about to say sounds silly, but I'm leaving it for the end because it's the most important part. This is the oldest letter in the alphabet. The Phoenicians called it the wow, or whoa. It's based off of the Egyptian hieroglyph of a bird. Though, it's quite the stretch to imagine that this is that same bird. Whereas the Egyptian looks like it's standing sideways, the Phoenician crane looks like it's flying vertically with its wings straight out. This is the Great Phoenix. There are literally a quadrillion depictions of the Great Phoenix in this pose. Sometimes a letter Y, sometimes a J. Guys, this is the exact same pose that Jesus is making on the cross. He is the wow. And the epistemology of the meaning of words is really as simple as people saw something crazy and said, wow, whoa, look at that. And now when we draw that thing, we say, wow. The Star of Bethlehem was not just a sign of the Messiah. It was also a sign of the apocalypse. Every time the Messiah comes, the world recycles. The entire story of the Messiah, from birth to death and rebirth, is the story of the apocalypse. But you're gonna have to follow up with me in part 2 to hear more of my thoughts about what actually happens during the apocalypse and a deeper dive into some of the symbolism behind it. Next time, we solve the riddle of the Sphinx. A lot of you noticed that I've been going kind of heavy on the Jesus imagery on social media the last couple years. I'm going to explain what more of this symbolism means in part 2. But some of you are wondering, like, am I hinting at something? Am I trying to say something? Well, you figured it out, folks. It's true. I am the golden penis.